Hello and welcome to Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. Today on the show, I'll be reviewing a debate that took place between Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy and Alex O'Connor of Cosmic Skeptic on the problem of evil. If you like the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and if you want to support Help Me Believe, just follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. My name is Haden Clark, and this is Help Me Believe. Michael Jones and Alex O'Connor are two guys that I have a lot of respect for, and I enjoyed their last debate. Since I'm a Christian and Alex is an atheist, I want to say especially that I have a lot of respect for him because he's an atheist that I think takes the arguments for God seriously, or the arguments for theism seriously, and actually adds something substantive to the ongoing dialogue between atheists and theists, and so I applaud him for that. Now, up front, I want to say that I have selected clips out of context and for the express purpose of commenting on them, so you should definitely go watch the full debate, which I'll have linked below, and of course subscribe to their channels, which I'll also have linked below. Okay, so let's get into it. Michael went first, and here's the first clip that I want to play of his.
Now, one of my biggest objections to the problem of evil is the objection is often stated with almost tunnel vision. What I mean is skeptics will often attack Christianity with evil, but they do so by not including the whole picture of Christianity. So skeptics will bring up examples like children who suffered from diseases and die young, and then say from their subjective standpoint that a good God would not allow this, but ignore that the child's consciousness would continue on in a heavenly experience. So if we're going to use evil to attack the Christian God, one must do so by looking at the whole picture of the Christian worldview.
So Michael wants to point out that if you're going to enter into the Christian worldview to argue against the Christian God, you must take on the whole Christian worldview, which is fair enough. If you're going to say, if the Christian God existed, why would he allow X, Y, or Z? Then it seems that the Christian should be able to answer using the entire Christian worldview, since the question assumes, for the sake of argument, the truth of the Christian worldview. Now, the aspect of the Christian worldview that Michael seems to want to include is the eternality of the soul, which is not agreed upon by all Christians, by the way. And that's fair enough. One does wonder, though, how does the fact that person P will live forever justify the fact that God would allow person P to undergo immense suffering? If you are going to grant that a God would prevent evil unless he had a morally sufficient reason to allow it, I fail to see how the fact that someone will live forever justifies the allowing of the suffering. As you can tell, as a Christian myself, I'm going to have a completely different take on the problem of evil than Michael or any of the other well-known Christian apologists out there today who tackle this subject. I have an immense amount of respect for Michael and others, but I am going to disagree with them at the end of the day. At any rate, and to continue the review, Michael expands on what he means here in the next clips.
Number one is the afterlife. The truth is we cannot judge Christianity without the acknowledgement of the afterlife, meaning that the suffering of this life is only temporary and will pale in comparison to eternity. So the argument is simply that the suffering in the present life will be swallowed up by the joy of heaven and will have no lasting effects when compared to eternity.
So to express my displeasure with this answer, let me use a brief analogy similar to the one that Michael just used. Suppose that I witness an adult abusing a child. I won't give any specific details, but just think of something horrific. I live in Texas, and I have a license to carry a handgun. I have my handgun concealed on my person at the time that I witness this abuse. Now, even if you are a pacifist and you don't think that I should use a handgun, most people would say that I have a moral obligation to intervene. Now, suppose that I don't intervene. Instead, the adult finally stops abusing the child and leaves. I then pick the child up and take them to emergency services. They get help, they see a therapist, and in fact, they grow up to be an outstanding citizen, they get married, they have children of their own, and they live a long, happy life, happily ever after. Does the fact that the child grew up to be happy justify me not intervening at the time I had a choice to? I mean, I don't think so, and I'm guessing that you don't either. Even if somehow I knew ahead of time that the child would grow up to be happy, I still don't think that that would justify me not intervening, and I don't think that you would either. So if you believe that God is morally obligated to stop evil and suffering, unless he has a morally sufficient reason to allow it, I don't see how a later eternal bliss justifies his non-intervention as a moral agent with moral obligations. I mean, I just don't see how that even gets off the ground as a justification. Now, in this next clip, I thought he was actually going to give a similar answer that I would give to the problem of evil, but he makes a statement that really shows the contrast between our positions, and I realize that I haven't stated my position yet, and I will actually near the end, so you're just going to have to hold out on that.
The second problem builds on the first, and it is to argue we cannot ignore the ontological differences between humans and God. As John Hick and Eric Reeton have argued, we are called to stop evil when we're able to, but the circumstances change for an omnipotent, omniscient being. Where if such a being would have the same requirements as us, it would result in some sort of dystopian police state, where there's no human dignity or freedom because God just controls everything. It seems God might be obligated to allow freedom and indirectly evil to prevent a worse state of affairs.
The ontological differences between us and God, to my mind, is the key to the problem of evil, and I thought that he might go down this route, but he immediately makes the statement there at the end of the clip that God would be obligated to prevent a worse state of affairs. The implication being that if God intervened and stopped every instance of evil and suffering, that this would take away free will, and that this would somehow be worse than a world without free will. The first thing to point out is that God would not be taking away human freedom by preventing evil. He would be limiting human freedom, but he would not be taking it completely away. My human freedom is already limited. There's many things that happen that are out of my control. My body does all sorts of things apart from my conscious will. I cannot will myself to jump to the moon unaided. I just can't do certain things. There's plenty of things that I cannot will myself to do. In that sense, my freedom of the will is limited in a number of senses. And since God is the creator of this world and human nature, then he is somewhat responsible for those limitations, right? So just by the mere fact of creating us with particular natures that we have, God limits our freedom of the will, no matter how indirectly that is. Why would it be morally wrong to limit our action such that we could not commit evil or suffering? Why would it ipso facto result in a quote-unquote dystopian police state? God is surely more capable than Hitler. He could surely actualize a world in which we don't commit evil or suffering and yet enjoy our existence. The two things don't seem to entail a contradiction, so that must be at least possible, right? So again, if God is a moral agent and he would prevent evil so long as he didn't have a morally sufficient reason for allowing it, I don't see how the limiting versus not limiting our freedom of the will serves as any justification for allowing the evil and suffering that we observe.
Third, one also needs to account for the fall of humanity. The current state of affairs was the result of humans electing to rule themselves instead of living under God. God desired for humans to live with him in an Eden setting, and we elected not to, and continue to elect that every day. We don't love our neighbor as ourselves.
Now, this is, of course, correct and explains the origin of human evil and suffering on the Christian worldview. The original Edenic state was one of bliss, innocence, and protection. Adam and Eve sinned, and sin brought death and corruption into the world, as even Paul tells us in Romans. But this is, of course, doesn't answer the question as to why God would allow this, if he is a moral agent such that he would prevent evil unless he had a morally sufficient reason for allowing it. Of course, Michael would say he has already partially answered that question, which I disagreed with for the previously mentioned reasons. So he draws this conclusion from the topic of Adam and Eve in the garden.
So the current world was not what God wanted, but he's allowing us to experience it in this dreamlike setting so that we can see the consequences of our actions and fully see what rejecting his lordship is like.
So this is like a parent who lets a child learn something the hard way, knowing that this is often the only way that someone will learn their lesson. And my parents were masters at this. The problem with applying it to God is that there are some instances of evil and suffering in which the person in question clearly didn't learn any lesson. Babies who suffer their entire short existence and then die as a result clearly didn't learn any lesson. Now, I know well and good that Michael would not respond this way, to such an instance, and I hate to make specific points like this, but with so many different examples like this to give, I fail to see how the learn your lesson the hard way serves to justify God in allowing many of the instances of evil and suffering that occur all the time. Again, if we take God to be a moral agent that would prevent evil unless he had a morally sufficient reason for allowing it, it seems the learn your lesson the hard way justification does not justify many instances at all.
Fourth, the most popular response to the problem of evil is to note the free will of humans seems to be the biggest cause of evil.
Michael is right that this is the most popular defense, and you will even find a clip of me defending this position over and against Cosmic Skeptic, nonetheless, in a response video that I made a while back, if you go back on the channel and look for it. I've since changed my position on this matter, and as pointed out earlier, I don't see how God limiting our free will such that evil and suffering caused by human beings would be erased is somehow more evil than God not limiting our free will in such a way. Again, it is not logically impossible that God could create a world in which our free will is limited to the extent that we do not cause evil and suffering, and also that we are happy and content with this. It doesn't have to lead to a quote-unquote dystopian police state. Because the two things are not logically contradictory, this is a possible world that God could actualize, and yet he has not. If God is a moral agent that would prevent evil, unless he had a morally sufficient reason for allowing it, it seems that he would do so in this instance.
Also, again, the basis for this seems to be an emotional standard rather than a logical one. The truth is it's hard for any of us to know when the right amount of evil, or where the right amount of evil is, or when evil is objectively set to be too much for a loving God to exist.
Now, Michael isn't responding to me in this clip, but I just want to point out that the emotions of it hasn't been a factor in the critique that I've made and in fact, I have been maintaining that there's no moral reason that God could not do away with all the evil. Never mind trying to figure out what the right balance of evil and freedom is. God could limit our freedom such that we do not commit evil and suffering acts, and also make it the case that we enjoy and prefer such a state of affairs while enjoying the freedom that we do have to operate within those parameters. God could do that. And so I'm not arguing that we have to know the right balance or anything like that, or that this is somehow based on emotions. And again, I know he's not responding to me. But what is the morally justifiable reason for expanding our freedom? Is more freedom really worth the evils that occur in our world? As Alex would point out, it's actually Michael who must say that the exact amount of evil must exist because this exact amount of freedom is better than any lesser amount. I, for one, cannot fathom how that serves as a moral justification, because again, limiting our freedom in order to maximize well-being might be a horrible idea when talking politics, but we aren't talking about tyrannical dictators. We're talking about God, who could obviously do a better job than Stalin or Hitler.
If God is going to create free creatures, but then limit how far they can go from his will, then there really is no freedom because we're set in some sort of giant cosmic playpen.
Again, I think that's obviously false. Limiting our freedom to a lesser degree than exists currently, but not fully eliminating it, in order to minimize the evil and suffering in the world, does not seem like something God cannot do, even if he is a morally obligated being. It's far from obvious that doing such a thing would make us God's playthings. We would still have freedom, just a lesser amount than we do now, and again, our freedom is already limited anyway.
Finally, any attack from the existence of evil cannot ignore the suffering of Christ. Now, I know this is a bit of an emotional argument, but since the sting of evil is more emotional than logical, it makes sense that God's answer to evil should be to heal our emotional wounds as well. So the Christian answer to a world filled with torture and murder is a God who was tortured and murdered. Atheist Albert Camus admitted, Christ the God-man suffers too. Evil and death can no longer be entirely imputed to him since he suffers and dies. The night on Golgotha is so important because the divinity ostensibly abandoned its traditional privilege and lived through to the end, despair included in the agony of death.
Now, I skipped some things that he said for the sake of time, and I wanted to play that last clip because I do think it's important to mention, and I applaud Michael for including it. The Christian God is not one who deals with evil and suffering. The Christian God is a God who deals with evil and suffering decisively. The ultimate end of suffering, evil, and sin is death, and Christ defeated death in his own death and resurrection. Those who put their trust in him will find salvation from all of these things. Now, this next one was pretty interesting.
Since evil is a separate issue in the evidence for Christianity, If if the argument from evil was successful, it would just show Christianity could still be true on its own evidence, and that there's no objective standard of good and evil. What I mean is sometimes I encounter Christians who believe right and wrong is just arbitrarily set by God. And they tell me if God made it so that it was okay to murder and steal, then it would be. In reality, they are Christians and moral relativists, who believe that morality is just arbitrarily set by God and has no objective basis. Now, I don't personally believe this, but this entails Christianity and moral subjectivism are technically compatible.
Now, he is correct in a sense. His argument could fail, and the Christians who ground morality in God's commands, divine command theorists, could be correct, thus entailing 1. Michael's argument fails, 2. Morality is subjective, and 3. Christianity is still true. This is a possible world. There's nothing logically contradictory with these 3 things all being true at the same time, but there's also another possibility, which I'll get to eventually. And I should mention that Michael doesn't actually hold to this position. But for now, let's switch over and see what Alex has to say. And I may actually skip through this pretty quickly, mostly because I wanted to state why I, as a Christian, find the common responses to the argument from evil made by Christian apologists unconvincing. And I also just wanted to analyze what an atheist has to say and then give a response that I think solves all of this quite decisively.
I used to think that the problem of evil was a bad argument on logical grounds because of the fact that there's always logical space for there to be morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering. You can always say that it can't be logically ruled out that there's some reason why God would allow the suffering in the world.
And this is the way that many theists try to respond to the argument from evil. They'll say, well, for all we know, God does have a morally sufficient reason for allowing evil. First, what kind of an answer is that? It's not really an answer at all. It's a bet. Secondly, if you are ceding that God is a moral agent, we do know what it is like to have morally sufficient reasons for allowing things to happen as they do. We also know when someone is not morally justified in their inaction. I was morally unjustified in my example earlier when I did not intervene to help the child being abused. We know these things. Right. It's not a question of ignorance. We do know these things. So it seems wholly inadequate to say that we don't know the same about God if we are willing to cede that he is a moral agent with moral obligations.
If somebody murdered a close friend of mine in cold blood and stole his wallet right in front of me, I couldn't logically rule out the possibility that my friend was some undercover political saboteur whose assassination prevented him from committing a war crime against the United Kingdom, and there was national security secrets in his wallet, and so the assassin actually did a good thing. Sure, that's not logically impossible, I can't rule that out, but not only would it be difficult to entertain this hypothesis as I watch my friend bleeding out on the floor, I'd also be somewhat troubled by anyone who tried to argue that it might be a good thing that my friend was murdered because of this reason, and that if I want to mourn his sadness, if I want to mourn him in sadness, if I want to say that's a bad thing, then I'd better be able to demonstrate that his death is logically incompatible with the theory of a benevolent assassin. I don't think that that would be my burden in that situation.
And I think he is 100% correct here. The evidential argument from evil is a good case that a God who is morally obligated to stop evil and suffering unless he has a morally sufficient reason to do so does not exist.
And if suffering does exist, the point is this. Any religion which purports the existence of a loving God must demonstrate why the suffering in the world is justified.
No, they don't. In fact, of course they don't. Here's why. When we talk about morality or moral behavior, we are talking about the actions of human beings. When we ask, is X morally good, we are asking, should a human being perform action X? Or in this case, is a human being justified in not doing X? Moral action is human action. We aren't talking about dogs, plants, or rocks. We're talking about humans. Thus, the question, is X morally good, becomes, is X good for a human being to do? Well, newsflash, God is not a human being and thus not a moral being, but I'm going to get to that here in just a minute. For now, it's worth noting that even if Alex wants to reject my take on God and morality, and I know I haven't spelled it out fully here, but I will, even on his account, God does not have to morally justify himself. Alex is a moral subjectivist. He believes that morality is not fundamentally objective. Essentially, in his belief, what we call morality is just agreed upon rules. Once we subjectively determine a goal, human flourishing, we can then determine objectively good paths at reaching that goal, and that's what we call morality. Those objectively good paths that achieve the subjectively agreed upon goal. But what makes Alex think that God has agreed to his or our subjectively agreed upon standard? The standard only applies to those who have accepted it. You can only count someone guilty that has agreed to meet the standard and then not met it. God obviously does not belong to this category.
In order to hold that suffering is compatible with God, with a God who is morally perfect, you must hold the belief that this suffering is somehow necessary to obtain the optimal end.
This is perhaps true, and it seems based upon his opening statement that Michael accepts the framing of this challenge. However, I would maintain the majority of classical theists throughout church history, do not accept this framing of the Christian God. The Christian God is perfect and good, but I would not say that he is morally perfect, because I don't think he's a moral being at all. If that sounds heretical, I would respond that you have been conditioned by too many neo-theists or theistic personalists. God is no more a perfect moral being than he is a perfect smelling being. God has no smell because he's not a physical being. God has no moral obligations because he's not a moral being. It's just not what he is. So I would happily deny that God is not a moral being and escape Alex's challenge altogether. I'll say more about this in just a minute. For now, Alex moves on to respond to the free will defense against the problem of evil.
This is a logical point. The absence of moral evil is incompatible with free will. And to answer this point, I have a question, which I've raised in a video before. Is there free will in heaven? Heaven is a place devoid of suffering, where nobody's killing anyone, no one's torturing anyone, no holocausts or wars are taking place. Yet presumably, unless heaven is the kind of robotic, compelled nature condemned by Michael, there must also be free will. If this is the case, then here we have an example of humans existing with free will, and yet there being no evil. Michael may wish to respond to this by saying that those in heaven still have a capacity for evil, but the very reason they're in heaven is because they're the kind of person who refuses to act upon it.
Now he goes on to make some further points, but I want to highlight that I see nothing illogical about God creating this setup from the beginning. Why couldn't God limit our freedom of the will such that we never choose to cause evil or suffering? I'm not saying that God eliminates our freedom of the will such that everything we do is determined by prior causes. I'm only saying that God could limit our freedom of the will such that we do not choose evil or suffering. On this view, a person would be free to choose good thing X or good thing Y or heck, even good thing Z. But they could not choose to do a thing A, which would result in suffering. Here you have freedom of the will and no suffering. God should have no problem in setting up a world like this. Someone like Michael would have to maintain that this world is somehow worse than the one we currently inhabit, the kind of world where horrible evils take place all the time. How our present world could be preferable to the one I just described is beyond me, and I would maintain that it is beyond you as well, dear viewer. Then Alex launches into a discussion about the higher goods response to the problem of evil.
In other words, the existence of some goods worth having necessitate the existence of some evils. For example, we can't have bravery without the existence of fear. In order for a soldier to demonstrate bravery by jumping on a grenade to save his comrades, a grenade needs to be thrown, right? If no such evils are ever committed, no such higher order goods can ever exist, and where would we be without things like bravery? But I submit the following. Bravery is only good in the first place by virtue of our need to overcome something bad. I'd rather have no fear and no need for bravery. If a soldier jumps on a grenade, we can congratulate him for his bravery, but we would be out of our minds to thank the person who threw the grenade and be grateful that it blew him up.
Well, that's one way of putting it, but I think he is absolutely correct. Why couldn't God create a world where such evils never took place in the first place? And thus there would be no need for these higher order goods, like bravery. Of course, God could do this. And as mentioned earlier, we would still have freedom of the will, just a more limited version than we currently do. Now Alex moves on to make what I think is his strongest point.
But also, the Christian must contend with the idea that if evil is somehow necessary, whichever account of necessity you give, we must have exactly the right amount of evil in the world. And this is something Michael seems to have implied in his opening statement. This is the most difficult thing for me to accept. If a loving God may need to allow suffering for reasons of free will, higher order goods, or personal development, or whatever it may be, this God would still not allow gratuitous suffering. It wouldn't allow more suffering than is necessary, because then that suffering wouldn't be necessary for good to prevail, and therefore would be unjustified. But it must also be accepted that therefore God couldn't have allowed any less suffering to exist, because this would imply that not all of the evil in the world is in fact necessary, and that therefore God does allow specifically unnecessary suffering, which is incompatible with an omnipotent, loving God. We have to believe in something of a best of all possible worlds approach, that exactly the correct amount of evil exists in the world. Any more, and God would be allowing unnecessary suffering. Any less, and God would be unable to procure whatever goodness is necessitated by that suffering.
Okay, so let me recap just real quick. Someone who accepts Michael's position that God is morally obligated to stop evil and suffering unless he has a morally sufficient reason for allowing it cannot allow in their system so-called senseless suffering or suffering that does not serve a morally justifiable purpose. What this entails is that exactly the amount of suffering that exists in our world is necessary to achieve God's higher morally justified purposes. Any less suffering, and there wouldn't be enough to achieve the higher morally justified purpose. Any more, and God would be allowing more suffering than necessary, and that would be morally unjustifiable. So anyone who maintains Michael's position must say that God could not reduce the suffering in the world one iota. It must be exactly what it is. Just on a prima facie level, this sounds absolutely absurd to my ears. How could you possibly think this? It seems obvious to me that God could reduce the suffering in the world, even if just by a tiny bit, and that would not throw a wrench in his higher purposes. Surely that's possible. It seems obviously so. But this is what you have to maintain if you think that God has moral obligations. Here, Alex puts the same problem much more bluntly.
1.31 million Jews were killed during the first 3 months of the Holocaust. Are we expected to believe that this is the perfect number? 1.32 million Jews would have been an unjustifiable evil because this was more than strictly necessary. 1.29 million wouldn't have been quite enough, and the world would be a worse place if those 30,000 extra people were saved. No, allowing 1.32 million Jews exactly to die is the Goldilocks number that is necessitated for good to obtain.
Exactly. This is an argument from absurdity or reductio ad absurdum, and I think it is a strong one. I don't think I could ever accept that position. Now, I'm not going to review their respective responses to one another. I'd like to point out what I think they both get wrong, and in fact, way wrong. Atheists who present the problem of evil as Alex just did, and theists who respond to the problem of evil as Michael just did, both make certain assumptions about God. The first assumption is that moral beings have a moral obligation to prevent suffering unless there is a morally justifiable reason for allowing the suffering. The second is that God is a moral being. The third, thus, God is morally obligated to prevent suffering unless he has a morally justifiable reason for allowing the suffering. And thus, Michael would say that there are morally justifiable reasons that God would allow suffering. And thus, Alex would say that there exist such evils in which God would have no morally justifiable reasons for allowing. But they both agree on the premises. First of all Alex could possibly prove is that God is not morally justified, not that God does not exist. We would just have to adapt our idea of God, which is exactly what I think we should do, but for different reasons. To me, and classical theists, premise 2 is false. God is not a moral being. God does not have moral obligations. And this stems from the fact that God is not like us. God is completely other. He belongs to a category all of his own. In other words, he is wholly unique. There is no standard to which he is beholden. You and I have moral obligations because we are moral creatures. Our nature is such that we have moral obligations. To say then that God has the same obligations is, in my opinion, to make God in our own image. And this is exactly what theistic personalists do. They say that God is a person. And many of the currently well-known Christian apologists today, like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, and William Lane Craig, hold to this very position. God is a person, like us, only he's much better, smarter, bigger, faster, stronger. To me, this anthropomorphizes God, or brings him down to our level. God is not a person. There is not a category called persons to which belong human beings and God. God does not differ from us in virtue or something like that. He differs from us in kind. He is completely other than us. He is immaterial, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, etc. He's nothing like us or anything of our day-to-day experience. So I deny that God is a person or a moral agent. He does not make decisions as one beholden to a moral standard. Now, immediately, there will be a lot of questions from the theistic personalist crowd. I'll try to answer a few quickly, but I'd like to do a much longer video addressing the same topic. I also want to point out that theistic personalism is new on the scene. For the first millennia and more of the Christian church, classical theism was the assumed position by almost everyone. Nobody thought that God was a person like us or beholden to moral obligations. This is a new thing. For an academic representation of the classical theist position, I recommend Brian Davies' book, The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil, which I'll leave a link to below. So, is God good? Yes, but not morally good. Not because he does immoral things, but because he's not a moral being at all. He is good because he's perfect. God is pure act, having no potency or potentials. A being which lacks something has an unrealized potential, but God has no potentials. He is pure act, thus already and always having the perfections of his nature. So God is perfect. And surely it is true to say that he is good if he's perfect. It's just not in any moral sense because he's not a moral being. Are God's commands arbitrary or happenstance? No, of course not. It would be illogical for an omniscient, perfect God to command something that was bad for the creature that he himself created. It would be logically contradictory for an omniscient and perfect being to command evil. But God does not command that which is good because he is beholden to moral obligations or standards. Is God loving? Yes, of course. God wills that which is good for human beings. God does things that are good for human beings. Like sustain them in existence, for example. But God does not do them as one who is morally obligated to do so. Is God personal? If by personal you mean relational, then yeah, of course, God is maximally relational or personal, if that's what you mean by it. He is omnipresent and sustains everything in being. What could be more personal or relational than that? The theistic personalist who maintains that God has moral obligations, like us, ignores thousands of years of theological history and makes God into their own image. I'm not saying they do this intentionally. It's just, to me, seems like the obvious outworking of their position. God is not like us. He is not a moral being. He has no moral obligations. So, why does God allow evil and suffering? Well, whatever his reason is, it is not beholden to any moral standard. And so you cannot fault God on moral grounds for not meeting some moral standard because he is not a moral being. Stick around and I'll make a more detailed video on the subject. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and if you want to help me believe, spread and defend the truth of Christianity, just follow the Patreon link below and become a supporter of the show for as little as $1 a month. My name is Haden Clark, and this is Help Me Believe.